Welcome to our special council meeting of December 20th, 2023. The meeting has been called for the specific purpose of a presentation from Dr. Mike Moffat, Senior Director of Policy and Innovation, Smart Prosperity Institute, and Assistant Professor of Business, Economic and Public Policy, Group, Ivey Business School, Western University, International Student Housing. A discussion item at my request for the international student housing crisis within Canada and within the city of Brampton. Under Council's meeting rules, no other business can be considered at this special meeting. We have all members present here today except for Councillor Pleshy has other municipal business, and Councillor Medeiros is not online. Other than that, everyone is accounted for.
Oh, I'm online, Mayor Brown.
Okay.
Thank you.
We now have Councillor Medeiros. We are now at item 2, approval of the agenda. We have a motion moved by Councillor Keenan and seconded by Councillor Santos to approve the agenda. All those in favor? Motion carries. We're now at item 3, declarations of interest under the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act. Does any member have a declaration of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, the clerk will so note. Nice having the clerk here today too. We weren't ready to say goodbye to him yet, so we added a special meeting. Acting clerk. Delegations and correspondence. And maybe if I could just preface this before we go to Dr. Mike Moffat. The last year we've been talking about a housing crisis in Canada. And someone who has come and presented to the Ontario Big City Mayors, presented to the federal cabinet on housing, one of the most respected housing voices in the country, is Mike Moffat. And I found his commentary brilliant, and I thought it would really be insightful for us to hear what he has to say as we understand the crisis we are facing. We're a young person. Can't even dream of owning a home. A new family is coming to our community who have sacrificed so much to come to Canada. It is a distant dream to own a home. And part of that Canadian dream that has always been the case is falling farther and farther away. And one aspect that is particularly relevant in Brampton is international students. You know, Mike Moffat has really highlighted on a national level the pressure the increased international student visas has put on the housing system across the country. And that's probably no more significant than in the GTA. And probably within the GTA, nowhere is that more compounded than the city of Brampton. And there are solutions out there on an advocacy front where I think we could lead the discussion of what needs to be done to fix this. It's heartbreaking when you see examples of 12 students living in a basement apartment. This is taking advantage of their hopes and dreams. No international student should come to Canada with these dreams and then be living in conditions like that. Frankly, and it's not fair to the communities where it's overburdened in terms that there's not the housing infrastructure to support that. This meeting today comes on the heels of what was significant on Monday, where we had the signing of the city's international student charter, where post-secondary educations were agreeing and pledging how international students would be treated, how their experience would be in Brampton, first city to have an international student charter. And one aspect of the charter was on housing. Now, it's one thing to pledge that we're going to have housing, but there are tangible ways we can achieve this. And I believe today we can put forward some advocacy on how we can achieve that housing. But I want council and the public watching today to have a full appreciation for the context we have today, for the reality we have today. Because I don't think there's necessarily an appreciation for how much this international student growth has contributed to the housing crisis and what has changed in recent years. So on that note, I'm asking for council to receive this delegation. We're going to hear from him and then we'll receive it from Dr. Mike Moffat. And Mike, I believe we have you online. And I want to thank you for your time here today. And thank you for being the voice of reason within a very complex housing discussion happening across the country.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those kind words. I really appreciate it. So should we, are we starting with the presentation now?
Yeah.
Are we good to go? Okay, fantastic. So this is some discussion, some data on international students and population growth. So next slide, please. Now, we had some population data come out just yesterday, which is not incorporated into this, but it doesn't actually change the story much. If anything, it sort of shows even faster growth than before. But if we look at historic population growth in Ontario going back to the 1950s, the province typically grows by about 140,000 people a year. In the last 12 months, we've grown by 460,000. So 3.5, 4 times the population growth that we normally experience. Now, our population started booming in about 2015, 2016. We had a bit of a slowdown during the pandemic as international migration all but stopped. But this has rebounded in a big way. Next slide, please. So if we take a longer term perspective, that in any kind of 8-year period, Ontario grows by about 1 million people. We've grown by 2 million in the last 8 years, and we're growing by about 500,000 a year now, as shown in blue. Now, if we look in orange, that's housing starts. Housing starts are up a little bit in the last 8 years, but not substantially so, and certainly less than what we saw in the early 1970s. So there's a big disconnect here where our population is growing 2 to 3 times the traditional rate, but our housing starts are basically what they've been for the last 50 to 60 years. So you have more families and more individuals chasing a relatively flat number of homes. So next slide, please. So the question becomes, okay, well, where are they all coming from? Why is their population growing so quickly? So we can divide it out into 3 components. The first is immigration, shown here in blue. Immigration to Ontario is up somewhat. That's partially due to higher immigration targets, but it's also due to Ontario's share of immigration relative to the rest of Canada. Their economy has been relatively strong, and there's been traditionally a pattern where if oil prices are high, more newcomers settle in Alberta. When oil prices are a little bit low, Ontario's share goes up. So it tracks oil prices pretty well. But for the most part, immigration is not up substantially from where it was in, say, the late 1980s. Where we see the big increase is in this group called non-permanent residents. So international students and temporary foreign workers, and we'll divide that out a little bit more. They're in orange. And we see in most years, you can't even see the orange or it's pretty small. You have some years like in the late 1980s where there's some positive growth. In the 1990s, we actually saw the population of non-permanent residents decline as many of them left Ontario and moved back to their home countries. But right now, we've got this big boom. And again, this started about 2015, 2016, but absolutely massive numbers in the last 24 months. And then this gray area is basically all else. So that includes births, that includes deaths, that includes people moving from Ontario to another province or moving from another province to Ontario. And that's actually negative right now, that more than 100% of our population growth is coming from immigration and non-permanent residents. Everything else is actually negative. So we'd be sort of in decline, all else being equal. So next slide, please. So let's look at where they're settling. Now, unfortunately, we don't have data at the municipal level, but we do have it at the regional level. So blue here is Peel region. And what we're looking at is the number of non-permanent residents added in any single year. Up until 2016, this was basically zero for Peel region. That the number of people coming in as international students or temporary foreign workers was equal to the number of people who were leaving as international students or temporary foreign workers. So the overall population wasn't changing at all. That started to change around 2015, 2016. And in recent years, we've seen the population of temporary foreign workers increase, or non-permanent residents, primarily international students, go up by about 10 to 15,000 every year. And that's kind of compounded. So over 6 years, you're looking at 80 to 90,000. Most of that is occurring in Brampton. We don't know the exact proportions, but we know that Brampton is growing quickly in a way that Mississauga isn't. So it's safe to say the vast majority of this population growth, of this Peel region population growth, is occurring in Brampton. And if you look at 2022 to 2023, so basically the data that Statistics Canada has goes from Canada Day to Canada Day. So from Canada Day 2022 to Canada Day 2023, we see this massive increase across Ontario, nearly 300,000 people. Now, we don't know yet the geographic breakdown within Ontario. We'll get that data from Statistics Canada at the end of January. But given that Peel Region's portion tends to be, somewhat over 10%, I think ballpark, we're probably looking at 30 to 35,000 additional non-permanent residents settling in Peel Region, with the vast majority of those settling in Brampton. So you're looking at, 2 or 3 or 4% population growth in a single year from a single category. And that doesn't include population growth from births. That doesn't include population growth from immigration. So you're seeing, absolutely massive cohort of international students and temporary foreign workers in our cities without other orders of government building the infrastructure necessary for them, whether that be housing, schools, healthcare, and so on. Next slide, please. So we can look at who these non-permanent residents are. The Statistics Canada has a breakdown of types. So the first type is asylum claimants. We are seeing that population rise. It was about 68,000 across Ontario 2 years ago. It's about 90,000 today. So it is going up, but not at an extreme rate. The next category is work permit holders. So this includes things like temporary foreign workers, but it also includes people coming in on express entry on time-limited visas, and it includes international students who have finished their studies and now are staying in Canada under the post-graduation work permit program. So that's in orange. In gray is international students who are either here on a study visa or a combined study and work visa. That population has nearly doubled in 24 months. It used to be about 250,000 across Ontario. It's now at about 450,000. So 200,000 person increase in just 2 years, just of international students. And the yellow cohort is actually, a lot of them are related to international students as well. They're things like the children of temporary foreign workers or international students. So they're not here to study, but they're coming along as a family member of someone who is. And that population has nearly doubled as well, but it's relatively small. Gone from about 19,000 to 32,000 in 24 months. So big increases just in the last 24 months. Next slide, please. And we can break it down further into types. So this is a little bit of older data from the province. And I'm happy to, if there's any questions about data sources, happy to provide all of that. So we see that it's largely coming from post-secondary when we look at the student permits, that top line there. The International Mobility Program is largely looking at people who are here on a work visa. And we see since 2014 a massive increase in what's called post-grad employment across Ontario. It's gone from 35,000 to 165,000, and it's probably, I would say, close to 300,000 now. So again, these are people who graduate from a university or college in Ontario and then stay up to 3 years under the post-graduation work permit program and then apply for permanent residency. And then finally, there's a series of temporary foreign workers. They've gone up quite a bit in recent years. It's not really captured in the 2022 data, but we have seen a big increase in the number of temporary foreign workers as well. Next slide, please. So it's also helpful to compare Ontario to other provinces. What we're seeing in Ontario when it comes to international student permits is an increase, but a faster increase than the rest of Canada. So if we look at the third quarter of 2021, there were 280,000 international students, people defined as having a study visa or study plus work visa, and about 250,000 in Ontario. Now, if we go fast forward to the third quarter of 2023, that Ontario now has more. It has 444,000 international students, whereas the rest of Canada combined, all the provinces and territories combined, have about 411,000. So Ontario has roughly about 54% of international students, whereas we tend to have less than 40% of domestic post-secondary students. So it's a big difference. We disproportionately have more than most, than all the other provinces and territories put together. Next slide, please. And this is largely occurring at the college level. So this data is from a company called ApplyBoard out of Waterloo, who is one of the companies that helps schools attract international students. And when we look at the number of new study permits approved by study level, we see this is largely a college phenomenon. There are universities that are increasing their international students, and they're worth talking about. And you'll see in yellow that the university's population of international students or incoming international students has doubled in recent years. But the college level is just absolutely massive exponential growth in the last few years. Next slide, please. So here is some data that I actually just found a few days ago. This was an immigration consultant got this from the federal government under an access to information request. And what it shows, or what the question that they asked the federal government was how many international student visas have been issued by institution from the beginning of 2022 to April of 2023. So 16 months. And what we did is we took the data and we mapped out what the institution was, if it's a college or university, if it's outside Canada or outside Ontario or inside Ontario. Well, it turns out the 14 institutions that have been issued the most international student permits in that 16-month period, 13 of those 14 institutions are in Ontario. 11 of those 13 are colleges. So, Conestoga in particular is, really punching above its weight, having over 30,000 international student permits issued in just 16 months. Centennial is second at 14,996. To put it into context, those two schools combined had more international student permits issued than all of the big U15, 15 biggest Canadian research universities combined. So that's U of T, Western, Queen's, UBC, McGill, and so on. Those 15 universities didn't have as many international students put together as, or international student visas put together as Conestoga and Centennial. And the important thing to note here is that there is absolutely no requirement for an international student to live in the community where their main campus is. So although Conestoga has a number of campuses, in places like Kitchener and Brantford and so on, we know, at least anecdotally, that a lot of those international students are living in Brampton. for a variety of reasons. A lot of it is that they know people in Brampton, and they knew people from Brampton before they came to Canada. So it's a geography they're comfortable in. And same with Centennial. So Centennial's, most of Centennial's operations are in the city of Toronto, but we know a lot of those students live in Brampton for, again, a variety of reasons around comfort and cost and so on. So this is a massive disconnect. And we know that these schools, particularly the community colleges, build very little student housing. There's absolutely no requirement for them to do so. And actually, many of them don't have experience doing so. That, they're community colleges and called community colleges because historically they educated people who already lived in the community. So there was no need for housing. But this has changed in recent years, where in order to expand and make up for budgetary shortfalls, the colleges have heavily recruited internationally. And the bulk of international students at the college level are from a single country. They're from India. And you can even get more geographically specific from that. They're from the north. So this is, essentially what's going on, that colleges are massively expanding for a variety of reasons, creating almost no housing whatsoever. And it's as the mayor mentioned, that you're seeing 12 or 15 international students living to a home because there's just a lack of space, there's a lack of affordability, and so on. So the students themselves are by far the biggest victims of this, but there are spillover effects across the entire community. And that's not to suggest that the international students themselves are the problem. I was an international student in two different countries. They're not the issue. The issue is that schools are increasing their enrollment without any plans whatsoever on knowing how this population will be housed, the transit that they need, and so on. Next slide, please. So just some notes here that, again, as I mentioned, there's very little new on-campus housing being built. There are a few colleges and universities are building residences, particularly the universities. Now, and one of the things I should mention about the curriculum of these schools is that a lot of the classes are done online, which makes it even easier for students to live wherever they want, wherever they're more comfortable. So, if you are only physically attending a class twice a week in Kitchener, then living in Brampton becomes an attractive option because you're not going in all of that often. And if it's, again, somewhere you're more comfortable, somewhere closer to job opportunities and so on, it would make sense for you. So, despite the fact that most of these schools don't have a presence in Brampton, though a few of them do, there are, as I'm sure everyone knows here, there are branch campuses in Brampton. The overall effect on the population is much higher than what the numbers would seem to suggest at the beginning, because, again, these students are mobile. Next slide, please. So, and one of the big spillover effects that we're seeing is across Ontario, there are high numbers of single detached and semi-detached homes being converted into student housing. The students are often forced into cramped, unsuitable housing due to a lack of options, but this also creates pressures for first-time home buyers who are having to compete with investors for single-family homes. And we're seeing this all across Ontario. So my hometown of London, Ontario, I grew up about 7 kilometers south of Fanshawe College. And when I grew up there in the 80s, I didn't know a single college student there, and if there was one, they were living with their parents. But now we're seeing entire neighborhoods like the one I grew up in become a sea of student housing. And we've always had student housing close to campus, but now that definition of close to campus is getting further and further out. So we're losing all of this housing stock for families into international student rentals. So this is not just a rental issue. When we look at the issues of housing and students, this is having massive spillover effects to first-time home buyers and young families. Next slide, please. And we can see this if we look at the data on single detached and semi-detached homes relative to population growth. So the orange line is population growth. And it's basically the line I showed you earlier. The blue line is the number of single and semi-detached starts. Now you'll note that the axis is different for each. And the axis is different from each because we know that more than one person lives in a home. So I tried to sort of account for that. The ratio is basically about 3 to 1. So, I changed the axis to kind of illustrate, how many people would be reasonable to live in a home. And you'll see from the 1950s up until about 2015, they tracked each other pretty closely. Like population would go up and housing starts would go up and, sometimes they'd go down and they would, the levels tracked each other very, very well. But since 2015, there's been this massive disconnect where, the population is absolutely booming, but we're not building that many homes, particularly of these forms. We are building a lot of one-bedroom condos and things like that, but they're not necessarily all that family friendly. And then, again, I can't stress this enough that this is one of the big challenges that all of this is causing in Ontario is a lack of homes that are suitable to raise a young child in. Next slide, please. So how did we get here? Right, because we want to fix the problem. I think we need to understand how we get here and how we got here. And this isn't, my intention is not to assign blame, but I guess I kind of am. But I think we have to sort of figure out what's going on. That, first of all, that public-private partnerships are prevalent, particularly at the college level. And this started under the previous provincial Liberal government, where public school, whether it be like a Fanshawe, a Conestoga, or so on, can enter into a partnership with a private institution where the private institution does most of the actual teaching and has allowed these schools to open up branch campuses across the GTA. So you see a school like Lambton College in Sarnia has a very heavy presence now in the GTA, thanks to these public-private partnerships. We got here because international student tuition is high. It's a cash cow for the colleges in particular, and they've kind of needed a bit of a cash cow because other funding sources for higher education are somewhat limited. The grants from the province aren't keeping up with inflation. We know that the provincial government froze and cut tuition and so on. Now, I would suggest that the colleges are, at least some of the colleges are expanding far faster than they need to, but we should understand that the financial pressures that they're in, that they are needing to find new ways to raise revenue. Next slide, please. The federal rule. Now, international student rules have been liberalized over the last 15 years and transitioned into a pathway for permanent residency. So, we as a country, we made the decision, back in the 2000s that it kind of made sense to integrate our immigration system with our higher education system. Because we know we've always had an issue in this country with foreign credential recognition, right? You bring somebody over at 28 who graduated from a school that nobody's really familiar with. They tend not to have great labor market outcomes. And that's why you see, doctors and nurses and electricians, driving taxis and working at Pizza. So we kind of decided, the federal government over a number of decisions over the last 15 years, starting under the Harper government, but really accelerating under the current one, say, okay, well, instead of bringing people over at 28, why not bring them over at 18? They can get their degree or diploma here. And we can kind of bypass that whole foreign credentials issue. So it theoretically makes a lot of sense, and I think there's a lot of logic to it, but we've allowed it to kind of grow out of control and not keep up with our housing stock. And it's created a real issue at the municipal level for planning because, unlike immigration or permanent residency, there's no target or cap, right? I can tell you with some degree of confidence that there will be, 500,000 new immigrants in, say, the year 2025. I can't tell you if there will be 50,000 new non-permanent residents or 500,000 non-permanent residents or a million non-permanent residents. I don't know, because that's a decision that's collectively made by the schools, the provincial government, and federal government. So how can you plan in that kind of scenario where you don't know how fast the population is going to grow? How can you create not just create enough housing, but make sure you have enough transit and healthcare and so on? And the federal government plays a role that they have to approve any international student that comes in and gives them a student visa. And we should note that the rejection rate is actually pretty high for some schools. For Conestoga, it's about 50%. So the federal government right now is already rejecting about half of the people that Conestoga is letting in into their programs. They go to get the student visa, and the federal government's like, no, you don't meet the conditions we sent. So these numbers could actually be quite a bit higher if it weren't for the federal government putting some restrictions on this. But those restrictions are basically pass fail. They don't say, okay, we're going to take the top 100,000 students or things like that. It's a binary criteria. If you meet the criteria, you get the visa. If you don't meet the criteria, you don't. Next slide, please. So the federal government is making some, I would argue, modest reforms to the system. One of the rules to get an international student visa is you need to show that you have at least $10,000 so you can afford to live. And this $10,000 rule hadn't been updated in about 20 years. It hadn't been kept up with inflation. So the federal government said, okay, you know what? We're going to boost that up to $20,635 to make sure that when students get here, they're not having to immediately rely on food banks and that kind of thing. And we are seeing a lot of that, particularly in Brampton. And, although I would classify these reforms as being pretty modest, the talk coming from the federal government is not modest, so they're talking tough. So the immigration minister came right out and said, there are in provinces the diploma equivalent of puppy mills that are just churning out diplomas, and this is not a legitimate student experience. So, they're talking tough yet. They haven't really backed it up with actions, but they at least seem aware of the issues. Next slide, please. So in summary, Ontario added 423,000 non-permanent residents in the last 2 years, and that number is probably higher with the data that came out just yesterday. And to put that into context, in the 20 years prior, we had only added 417,000 non-permanent residents. So we've added more in the last 2 than we did in the previous 20. That population boom is largely due to an increase in the number of international students. A substantial portion of new international students settle in Brampton. I would say in percentage terms, it might be the highest in Ontario. I can't say that for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised relative to the overall size of the population if Brampton is attracting the most international students. And currently, the federal and provincial governments lack any kind of plan to manage this growth or to link student growth with housing growth. So I'll end it there. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for that detailed presentation, Mike. You're a wealth of data, and certainly how this affects and intersects with Brampton is both fascinating and challenging. For the purpose of the conversation, I want to ask one question, and I know Councillor Santos and Keenan have some questions as well. But the first question I want to ask is, if the international student visa required a housing address, how would that change the dynamic? In the sense that, we hear from colleges and universities that students will automatically go to the cheapest price. So they can build student housing, but if someone has the option to have 12 people, to pay $200 a month and have 12 people staying in a basement apartment, the cheapest option will always win out, and it's why their efforts at housing have not been successful. But if there was a program that said you have to have a housing address and 12 people at one basement apartment that is zoned for no more than 4, different individuals wouldn't qualify, would that not incentivize the need to actually build housing?
Yeah, I think it would. I think there absolutely should be restrictions on how many international students or just students in general. But it's easier to do with international students. How many of them are at a single address? And I think we can do that through things like the visa and making sure that you don't have 12 students, living in the same home, because that is an issue. And, obviously there is bylaw enforcement to, do what they can. But I do think that the federal government can be doing more to ensure that you don't have that level of overcrowding.
Now, Mike, I've been really impressed with the new immigration minister, Mark Miller. We worked really well with him in Brampton on the asylum crisis, and he was hands-on, and he adapted when traditionally the bureaucracy has not been willing to adapt. And so I think there could be a willingness here on the federal government's part to be creative to deal with this housing crisis. You've advised them as well. Do you think there's an openness with the federal government to look at some of these areas that have not been looked at before?
Yeah, I absolutely do, particularly given the tough talk that we're seeing from this minister, that he is aware of the problem. He believes it is an issue. They have made steps to change some of the visa rules. I know there's an initiative now to make sure that the letters, the acceptance letters, are actually coming from the schools and are not fraudulent. So there are things that are being done, and I think there are more that can be done. Looking at capping the number of visas that any institution receives, and tying that to having some kind of housing plan, so schools can't issue 30,000 international student visas without any kind of plan to know, okay, where are these students going to live, and can the communities in which those schools operate in the surrounding communities, can it actually support that level of growth?
Okay, thank you. It's certainly not appropriate to see international students used as an ATM to essentially subsidize post-secondary education institutions. And that's sort of the hard conversation that people aren't having right now. Over to Councillor Santos.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mike, for coming to delegate today. If I may, I have some questions about some of the slides you shared in the presentation. So, Mr. Clerk, if you could forward it over to the breakdown of the chart of the timing. I can't remember. I don't know what slide number it is, but it's not that one. Keep going. Not that one. It's a line chart from
44?
Q3 2021
I think we passed
all the way to 20.
We passed it. Go back.
Not that one. Anyway, Mike, there was a big jump from in Q3 2021, anecdotally on the ground in Brampton, and slightly just before that, especially during COVID. Anecdotally, that's the one. Anecdotally on the ground, we started to really feel it in terms of the number of international students in our community. And how did we feel it? We felt it as councillors and as a mayor from residents in local neighborhoods who were day after day complaining about the quality of their neighborhoods, but also the transformation of single detached, semi-detached homes into multi-unit dwellings, legally or illegally, registered or not registered, we were feeling it. And in Q3 2021, that is exactly when we started the process for our international students charter, and working with those nonprofit agencies, with the post-secondary institutions within Brampton, because that's all we could control, within Brampton, as well as Peel Regional Police, Region of Peel, to figure out within our own jurisdiction municipally what we could do to improve the situation for international students and housing, especially in Brampton. And from that charter, we also did work, Councillor Keenan, myself, to start licensing landlords. Because what we were also finding, Mike, was that the landlords had no accountability, but were creating living conditions for these students that were horrific.
Yeah.
And so that has started, and we're implementing that program in 2024. What is not in our jurisdiction, and what we had understood over the past 18 months of getting to the point on Monday where we finally signed the guiding principles of the charter, is data. One of the biggest challenges that we face, and you're helping us today with some of that data, is data. The schools themselves do not have a requirement to provide data to the municipalities, and that has been one of our biggest challenges, because like you said in this presentation, some of these students, and 30,000 of them are in Conestoga, huge number. Anecdotally, again, without the data, we know many of them live in Brampton. And you used the term substantial number of students live in Brampton in your presentation. How do you know that without having that? How do we know that without having that specific data?
Yeah, so we have to kind of piece it together, because right now the data that Statistics Canada provides is at a regional level for non-permanent residents. So we have to couple that with the fact that if we combine overall population growth data, which we do have at the municipal level, we know that Mississauga is experiencing almost no population growth. Caledon is experiencing a little bit, but because the vast majority of population growth in the Peel region is occurring in Brampton, we can say, okay, well, we know overall Brampton's population is the majority of the majority of growth in Peel region. And then we can say, okay, well, since we know a lot of that growth is coming from international students, we can tie the two things together. But overall, it would be nice to have the exact number. It would be nice for Statistics Canada to not just release this at the regional level, but release it at the municipal level. And I would go further. Like the way that we got this data on the number of international student visas issued by institution was filing an access to information request, which in my mind is completely unreasonable. That the federal government should be regularly making this data available to municipalities and researchers and so on, rather than us having to go ask the federal government for it. So there's a huge data gap, and a lot of this, this data exists, right? So we're not asking them to calculate anything that's not there. They already have it, but they're not making it publicly available.
Yeah, and thank you for that, Mike, because that is the exact same problem that we had in speaking with our various partners in coming together to put the charter together for Brampton. If I could go to that previous slide, Mr. Clerk, with the huge spike in the number of colleges, that's the one. Mike, so my question on this one is this private or publicly regulated colleges?
The vast majority is public, so it includes both. The vast majority is public. Though we should note that in Ontario, the lines are really blurred between public and private because of these public-private partnerships, where A student on paper attends Lambton College and is brought in on an international student visa for Lambton College, but is actually a private institution that does the teaching. But for the most part, at the visa level, it's, I would say, about 90% that are attending a public institution.
Okay, thank you for that, because because private colleges are regulated differently than the public institutions, correct?
Correct. Now, again, noting that if it's a public-private partnership institution, then it looks more like the public regulation. So you really have sort of three different things. You have the sort of pure play public, the public-private partnership, which is closer to the public, and then the pure private schools, like the language schools, flight schools, those kinds of things. Yeah, they are regulated differently.
Okay, and that makes it even more challenging when it comes to accessing data. And in Brampton, for example, in the work that we did, Mike, in Brampton through the Economic Development Office, we know that there are over 70 private colleges in Brampton who are nowhere close to being regulated in the same way as a public institution. We have no idea how many students they have. We have no way of knowing where they're living in the city or if they're not in the city, et cetera. So that's another layer of issues that we have. The other issue we have is Conestoga, again, for example, where you've got a college that is outside the boundaries of the city of Brampton, and then at the same time, their students are living in the city of Brampton. So where do they go to the library? What community center do they use? When there's a community safety issue, what police do they actually call? It's not the Kitchener Police, Kitchener Region Police, it's Peel Regional Police. It's our community safety office. It's our agencies who are providing mental health support. It's, the Peel Regional Police and the fire department who have to deal with unfortunate suicides that are happening in our community. And all of these different impacts are not being felt in the municipality of which they are enrolled, which is Conestoga College. Meanwhile, Conestoga College is making millions of dollars off of the 30,000 students who have enrolled at their school. So my next question is, and maybe you know this or not, Mike, does Conestoga have any sort of housing plan that actually supports the students, those 30,000 students who are enrolled in Kitchener, or wherever they're?
I have not seen one. No, I have not. I've not seen one. And there are all of these campuses popping up. Again, they have campuses in Brampton and some other places. But no, I have not seen a housing plan for them. I have seen their financial statements, and they did, record a profit of over $100 million last year. So this is significant money that we're talking about.
Yeah, $100 million in profit, and yet, many of their students are living in the city of Brampton and flushing their toilets in the city of Brampton, I might add. And we love our students, but when you take a look at the equitable distribution of revenue, whether that's the heads and beds levy that is determined by the province, or the revenue generated by the colleges themselves, it's really, really unfair, and it's on the backs of the Brampton taxpayers. Sheridan, Algoma, and Trios. Trios is a private college. They have all three of them signed our charter, and they are local institutions within our control because they are within our jurisdiction. There are other institutions in Northern Ontario who have students living in Brampton because of the impact of online learning. Do you think that some of that is also driven by the population and growth of international students coming to Brampton in terms of online learning platforms?
Yeah, absolutely, and it is making a difference where students can attend an institution anywhere in Ontario and take most of their classes online. Now, we are seeing a number of institutions like Algoma, for instance, talking at the university level, that do have branch campuses in the GTA. But even those branch campuses, often most of the classes are done online, and they might just go in and take a test. I know the federal government is looking at or has mentioned the possibility of rules that would require a certain percentage of classes to be done in person in order for the students to be eligible for the post-graduation work permit program, which is one of the big draws for international students is the possibility to stay after their studies. And that may be one way to address this issue, that if there was a higher requirement for more of the classes to be done in person, then you would likely see international students and just students in general living closer to the institutions where they're taking their studies.
That's great. Thank you, Mike. I don't have any further questions. I know that there are a couple motions that we're going to be bringing forward based on your very informative presentation. Thank you very much, Mike, for coming in to delegate today.
Councillor Keenan.
Thank you, and through the mayor, thank you, Mike, for that presentation. So much information. This is the international students and the housing crisis, and when you're trying to get numbers, it's always been tough, at least for me. So to see the detail that you're bringing in here really shines a light on it. And I think the important part here is we as the municipality can't do this alone. We need the support of the other levels of government, and we need them to step up as well and do their part. We as a council in this term have been doing lots, and kudos to Councillor Santos, who's doing this 4 years before I got here. So I'm happy to join forces, because a lot of the institutions and students live directly in our wards, and our communities are directly impacted by this. We hear it every single day. And to see this presentation really shows that the other levels of government can do something. You have a lot of great ideas on what they can do. But when we talk about the housing piece, I feel that there's also the private sector that we really need to step up as well. So if I do have one question, because Councillor Santos really covered a lot of the questions I was going to ask, but what can we do as a municipality to encourage the private sector to build more student housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of it has to do with the traditional issues of zoning and planning and that kind of thing. So again, to use London, Ontario as an example, one of the issues that why we don't see more housing built near Fanshawe is infrastructure constraints. There have been proposals to put in mid-rise and high-rise apartment buildings close to campus, and there's just not the sewage capacity to do that. So, there's an area for the municipality, but also sort of requiring support from other orders of government, because I don't think it's completely reasonable for a municipality to have to pay for all that infrastructure in order to support the growth of the higher education sector. Because, we should call this what it is, that, because provincial governments, and not just this one, but previous provincial governments have really, cut costs when it comes to higher education, particularly at the college level. The colleges are making that up through increased enrollment, but that pushes costs onto municipalities. It's basically a stealth form of downloading from the province to municipalities. So I think what the municipalities, what we need to see is a recognition that, okay, if we're going to have all of these international students and ideally living in better conditions near campus, that's going to require more infrastructure to be built, and that's going to require more dollars coming in from the province and the federal government to have the sewers and the parks and everything else to be able to support that student population.
Yeah, and thanks for that. It's just I'm hoping that these motions that are about to come forward really, get to where they need to be so that we can actually work together with our other levels of government to actually start to do something about this. And, with these motions and making the changes at the other levels of government are really going to impact our communities directly. So again, thank you so very much for that presentation. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Deputy Mayor Singh.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Mike, for presenting. We haven't had to really put in a concrete report like this before, so I found it very informative. I know my residents will find it very informative, and it's definitely an issue. And it was good, just a good all-around presentation, and I look forward to seeing the motions coming out from my colleagues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Mayor Singh. Now let's, thank you, Mike. I believe we have some motions we want to put forward now. So why don't we put this on the screen, the first one, the federal one. Oh, we'll move a motion to receive the presentation, moved by Deputy Mayor Singh, second by Councillor Keenan. All those in favor? Passed. Thank you, Mike, for your wisdom and knowledge and perspective on this housing crisis we have.
Well, great. Thank you for having me today. Really appreciate it.
So we've got the draft of the motion. Put it up on the screen for those to look at. I also want to add to this at the end that this resolution be shared with other cities through AMO, FCM, and all federal MPs. And the region appeal. And then maybe just looking over to communications, I would sort of want their help to help make this. I'd almost want to have a website where we can just, anyone who wants to see Mike's presentation and our resolution, they can just go to a website that says Student Housing Now or something like that. Something really straightforward for other cities to look at. Maybe even a petition they can sign. So like, would we want to include that in the motion, that corporate comms put this on a website?
To you, Mayor, if we could put that in the motion to have our comms folks look at what we can do on that and potentially have that on our website.
Yeah. The strategic comms support the advocacy of this.
Yeah.
Commissioner Ganesh, you're itching to say something.
Through the mayor, one thing we could do is we have a housing website where our housing pledge and targets are already uploaded for the public, so perhaps this could be part of that. But certainly,
maybe they link each other.
Link each other because they are somewhat related.
I really want to zone in on the student housing component of this. And really simple for other mayors and councillors to see. This is the presentation. You look at those numbers, like I'd want this presentation. I'm sure we can share the video. I want everyone else to see it. I want them to see the staggering volumes that we're seeing. Okay, Councillor Santos, followed by Councillor Tour.
Thank you through you, Mr. Mayor, and given all of our work on international students, I have to say I'm really proud that Brampton is continuing to take the lead on this issue, and I'm very happy we're adding the forwarding the information over to FCM in particular, as well as our local MPs. I just want to look at the therefore be it resolved, requesting for every student visa issued a direct linkage to appropriate accommodation referencing a specific home housing address in close proximity to their community of study. And that speaks to exactly what we were talking about earlier in terms of making sure that when students are applying for a visa, they have a place to live and we know what municipality they're actually going to. The other piece here is implement a more restrictive visa policy and put a cap on student permits issued and prioritizing student permits for post-secondary institutions implementing student housing plans. I need to give a shout out to Sheridan, Algoma University, and Trios College. They signed our charter. Not only did they sign the charter, but they are also implementing student housing plans in a very responsible way and utilizing our licensing landlords program and working with the municipality so that we have high quality housing for the students who come to live in Brampton. Now, those colleges and post-secondary institutions are within the jurisdiction of Brampton. Conestoga College is not. And what's lacking is that data. And that's why it's important to make sure that the visa and the housing addresses are specifically tied together, because it is unfair for the city of Brampton to be taking in so many international students who don't even study in our city. And so that's another very important piece as well, and certainly support the addition of strategic communications to communicate this out to our residents as well. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor Tour.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Mayor. In the resolutions, in the first resolution, and just to give it some context, we're talking about the accommodation in close proximity to the community of their study. The problem that we have currently right now is that the college system, the middlemen that come between students and colleges and the immigration process, they've really, for lack of better words, have victimized these students. They prey on these students, right? And the federal government said the requirement's going to go up to $20,000 for the visa. Again, like that money eventually somehow is still going to the burden of that is still going to be felt here. When we talk about that accommodation, I don't want that to sound like a responsibility of a student that's coming here. Again, it is the fault of it is a faulty system that we have here. So if we could amend that language there to talk about accommodation that is managed, operated, or run by the colleges, to be more appropriate. Because at the end of the day, again, a student that's not living in Canada, coming to Canada for the first time, won't be finding accommodation on their own. They're going to rely on a third party to do that. There's going to be people out there sort of selling these accommodation papers, making, this is going to create a whole different system out of it too if the federal government was to implement this. So I'd rather that be the responsibility of the colleges that are accepting these students. So if there's some language to just take that into consideration for the first resolution. And I would also like to propose that if we could actually, similar to the housing fund that we just got was $114 million. Compared to Mississauga, they got $113 million. You look at this presentation, you know the burden that we face versus Mississauga. They have a declining population. We have a fast-growing population. Look at our transit facilities. Look at our transit system. How many students take our transit, right? Like that number is incredible. The burden on our community centers, on our rec centers, things like that. I'd like to make the ask of the federal government that we receive appropriate funding as well. Whether it is funding to address housing gaps, whether it is to address infrastructure gaps, whether our recreation systems, our transit systems, things like that, because they're not accounted for today. In our census, our population is what, 700,000 on census right now? But we all know in this room that it is not, it is far greater than that. And census won't capture that. The federal government doesn't capture that in terms of people that actually live in Brampton, and we don't get the money for that additional 200, 300,000 people that live in Brampton. I think part of this advocacy should be that we add that as another additional point, requesting the federal government to address those gaps in funding and tie that into true numbers of population, not based on the current census population.
So, Councillor Tour, I think you make a really good point here. If we actually had the academic institutions providing the address of where they live, if someone's going to Centennial College or Conestoga, it would start to show the true numbers we have in Brampton, which affects our funding for transit, which is usually done on per capita. There's so many different federal programs that are done on per capita. If there's 100,000 international students in Brampton, or 90,000, 80,000, whatever the number is, we know that number, that changes the dynamic for all funding applications. Of course, the language is, there'll be college and university owned residences, but I imagine the vast majority will become private owned. It'll be someone renting out their basement, but not to 12 people, but to, an appropriate number. It'll be, the private sector, if there's a demand, will start building student housing. Right now, there's not a demand because they know they're just going into horrible conditions. But if this onus changes, yes, it's coordinated by post-secondary institutions, so because it can be both public or private.
It could be approved by the college, it could be managed by the college, anything. But as long as it's part of the.
I think I like that language, as coordinated by post-secondary institutions.
It could be as another resolution for the funding.
And should we state, I know this is really big for Councillor Santos and Keenan and Visante, within municipal bylaws, like part of the problem is I wouldn't want a system set up where you could have 30 people for a residential address. Part of the challenge we have right now is that housing is not within municipal bylaws. Like you gotta have one hand talk to the other. So maybe it is referencing home housing addresses in close proximity to the community of study, consistent with municipal bylaws.
Local.
Consistent with local municipal housing bylaws. Isn't this fun? One last time to test Peter Fay's wordsmithing as we do motions on the fly that he's not going to miss at all. But the best motions come when we are all brainstorming what is missing. Federal funding. Federal funding for municipal services. They like to use the term federally housing supportive infrastructure. I'm just wondering what you use their term. Yeah. So federal funding for housing supportive infrastructure and programs required to support international students. Required, right? Federal funding for housing supportive infrastructure
Required to support.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, a request for a recorded vote on the first motion.
Through you, the Mayor, a recorded vote has been requested. All those in favour, please stand to be counted. Okay. Voting in favour, we have Councillor Brar, Councillor Santos, Councillor Keenan, Mayor Brown, Deputy Mayor Singh, Councillor Tour, and Councillor Power. Councillor Fortini, how do you vote?
In favor?
Thank you. Councillor Visante, how do you vote?
Yes, in favor.
Thank you. Councillor Medeiros, how do you vote?
In favor.
Thank you. That carries 10-0 with one absence.
Okay, and we have the next item, which is a provincial motion, and I believe Councillor Santos will introduce it.
Thank you through you, Mr. Mayor. So the Thank you through you, Mr. Mayor. So the whereas clauses are essentially the same as the first one, because to Councillor Keenan's point, all orders of government need to be part of the challenges, part of the solution to the challenges we face with respect to housing for international students and support for international students. This motion is particularly focused on funding, and I look to Councillor Tour because I know that you were asking about this. We've been doing this every single year, advocating to the provincial government to increase the heads and beds levy from the $75 rate that was never updated since the 1980s, to equate it to, index it to inflation to what we would actually get heads and beds levy for each student for today. So that would equate to $158 per student, which would annually equate to $117.2 million for Brampton. Now, the question is that enough given the statistics that we actually saw today? And the answer is definitely not. And so if we scroll down a little bit more to the therefore be it resolved, what we're asking for here is for the heads and beds levy to actually increase accordingly, to double the heads and beds levy, that to ensure that there's funding available for municipalities from the provincial government. And then the second piece is actually to strengthen regulations and data, including the municipality in which the student resides, for private and public post-secondary institutions in order to hold them accountable to international students that are enrolled in their programs and more accurately and equitably distribute the heads and beds levy according to which municipality the student resides. So again, I point to Conestoga. Conestoga, we know now, has over 30,000 new international students within the past year or so. Many of them live in Brampton. Guess who's getting the heads and beds levy? Guess who's paying? Guess who Conestoga is paying? Which municipality gets the money for their heads and beds levy? Kitchener, not Brampton, even though their students are living in Brampton. So Brampton's transit, library, parks, recreation, police, fire, you name it, are supporting the students who attend school in Conestoga, but Kitchener gets the head and bed levy. How on earth is that equitable? And so this motion actually says, no, 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 Conestoga. You need to share where your students are living, and based on where they're living, that's where the municipality is going to get the revenue. So that is the motion regarding at the provincial level. The only thing I would add, Mr. Clerk or Madam Clerk, is to include the same forwarding of the motion to the region, AMO, FCM, and specifically local MPPs on this one, so that they know. And I'd also like to include the presentation from Mike Moffat as well, and a recorded vote as well on this. Oh yeah, and the StratCom piece. Include the StratCom piece. Sorry, Jason.
Jason has now noticed that when he leaves the room, we add him into the motion. Okay. Motion on the floor.
Okay, through you, Mr. Mayor, a recorded vote has been requested. Those voting in favor, please stand to be counted. Voting in favor, we have Councillor Brar, Councillor Santos, Councillor Keenan, Mayor Brown, Deputy Mayor Singh, Councillor Tour, Councillor Power. Councillor Fortini, how do you vote?
In favor?
Thank you. Councillor Vasante, how do you vote?
Yes, in favor.
Thank you. Councillor Medeiros, how do you vote?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, that carries 10-0 with one absence.
Okay. Well, that covers all the motions we were anticipating. I don't see any others. So we have the motions. That takes us all the way to bylaws. We have a bylaw. Is there a number for the bylaw? Okay. There's no questions. So just the confirming bylaw. I have a motion moved by Councillor Santos, second by Councillor Keenan to approve the confirming bylaw to confirm the proceedings and decisions from today's meeting. All those in favor? Motion carries. Our last item of business is item 10, adjournment. Council is next scheduled to meet Wednesday, January 24th, 2024, 9:30 a.m. I have a motion moved by Councillor Power, seconded by Councillor Brar to adjourn today's meeting. All those in favor? Motion carries. I want to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas, and to our outgoing clerk, a very, very happy retirement.